In this video, we're going to program the software for the controller in the Floatwheel. We are going to start from scratch. This is going to be a very long video, and I will likely also have a parallel upload of a different video if this is not something you are currently interested in watching. Like I said, this will be a very long video. We're going to do it from top to bottom, configure everything you need to configure on the Floatwheel. And if that is not for you, please check out the other upload going at the same time. I will have a link to it in the description, as well as a card that will pop up in this video. But this is not going to have any fancy editing, nothing like that. We are simply going to set this up using VESC tool. So if you got your Floatwheel or any other DIY one-wheeled skateboard all put together and it's mechanically sound, as far as you know, the next step is to configure it using VESC tool. I will have a link to VESC tool and the website and the VESC project also in the description below. If you want to see any other things or tips or advice or issues that are not presented in the video, I will have a blog post / article also linked down below. As you're doing this, you want to make sure you have the latest version of VESC tool. As of this video's recording, it is VESC tool 3.0, and the firmware that we are going to be updating the controller to is firmware 5.2. If you have a controller with an earlier firmware, most of them should be coming with something in the 5 point range. You want to update it. There are some settings that are in the 5.2 firmware that are not in 5.1. And also in the coming months, there may be another update with different settings that will make this function a little bit different, ride a little bit different. But as of right now, we're going to update this to 5.2 and then go from there. So we're going to turn it on, and once it does, there we go. It should detect it, and Windows, by the way, this is VESC tool on Windows. It should detect the controller, and I've already got the drivers installed. Every time I've connected any sort of VESC-based controller to any Windows PC, it has detected it and installed drivers on its own. So once that is on, it is detected and you're not getting any driver errors. On here, you're just going to auto-connect. Okay. Could not deserialize. Okay, so this is because the firmware on the controller and the software version are incompatible because they are different versions. This is running a beta version of 5.2, and we are going to update that. So always make sure that you are on the latest version. If you need to update that, then we are going to do that right now. So if you're updating from 5.0 or 5.1, what I recommend you do is go to the bootloader, and it should load it on its own, and you want to go ahead and update the bootloader first. Yes. There we go. Easy as that. If you are coming from 5.0 or 5.1 and then you try to install 5.2 without doing the bootloader first, it may get a bit wonky, it may not work, and so I just go ahead and upload the bootloader from the new version anyway. And so here we have, we're going to go ahead and update the firmware. It will clear all the settings, so just be aware of that. And that is what we're going to do. We're going to upload new firmware and then do the settings from scratch. I did save some notes. All right, let's go. And I did save some notes on settings that I've been toying around with that do work on this board. Your settings may or may not work as well, or rather my settings may or may not work for you. And while this is uploading firmware and doing its thing, I'm going to remind you that this is a long, unedited, and slow-moving video in an attempt to help anyone that is setting one of these things up from scratch or runs into any sort of firmware issues and they have to kind of go from there. Okay. Must wait at least 10 seconds before unplugging power, otherwise, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so yeah, we don't want to, okay, that means that it has rebooted, and there we go. So once the VESC-based controller, in this case it's the Balance Pro from Floatwheel, once that thing reboots and you hear Windows sort of connect back to it, then we can go back to, you can do this here or you can go to connection, either way. But we're going to go ahead and auto-connect. It is connected, fantastic, and we should be good to go. Let's see, firmware 5.2. This all looks great. Okay, so that's the first real step, is updating the firmware. As you saw, that was very easy. Went to the bootloader, then we did the firmware. Now, when you are setting this up, you really want nothing to be in the way of the motor, because during the motor configuration, it will spin, it will move, it will do detection of the hall sensors, so you don't want this to hit anything. Oh, there's something in the tire. Huh. Well, oh, cool, look, it's a metal thingy. That's great. Let's throw that away. And we will start. So now we are connected. Motor settings. So we're going to go through the motor setup wizard anyway. No, don't want to load anything. Motor type. FOC, which stands for Field Oriented Control. Next. You're about to configure the current limits. Keep in mind, okay, can image motor, yes. Okay, set current limits. Now, I'm going to give you some of my settings because I know what my current settings are for this particular setup and that particular battery. Yours may be different. On this one, I was using 90, nope, and 90, that's just the maximum. It very rarely hits that many amps going to the motor, but that's just what I had it set at, and I wasn't incurring any sort of faults or errors related to current, and so that's kind of where I have it settled at. So motor current max, 90 amps, motor current max break, that's regeneration current. Generally, you want these even because you want the power in either direction to be more or less even. Battery max, this is the ceiling of what it's going to pull from the battery. I think I had it set to 45, and this is going to be set to -45. Honestly, I've never seen it when taking data. I've never seen it pull more than like 15 or 20 amps. Well, one time I went to 25 amps and I had horrible voltage sag. And that's because that's a 1P battery. It's a very small battery, but I've never seen it go very, very high. It certainly never reached the maximum, so I'm going to leave it at that. And it's going to ask, would you like to configure a soft battery cutoff, etc., etc., etc.? No. And we're going to make sure that that is no when we go back into the settings. You do not want a battery cutoff for this. You want to use tiltback as an indication for when your battery is too low. And don't use a cutoff. The cutoff will actually throttle back the power to the motor while you're riding if the voltage dips below a certain level. And that would be bad because if you accelerate and you have some voltage sag and it starts to enter into the soft and then the hard cutoff where it shuts everything off, you will nosedive. And that would be bad. You want to have a tilt back signal to tell you the battery is getting too low, and that is how you want to warn yourself of low battery. You don't want any sort of voltage, low voltage cutoff on here. That would be bad. So here the motor uses hall sensors. You've not finished detection. No. Oh, I must have double clicked it. Okay, so we are going to detect all this stuff, and we're just going to go right from left to right and go down the line of detection. So measuring R and L, the motor is going to make some noises but not rotate. Here we go. Great. Now we're going to determine flux linkage. This is going to spin the motor, and it tells you make sure nothing's in the way. Okay, those values went green, fantastic. We will now apply these settings. Excellent. And now we will go next. Now it's going to detect the hall sensors. So we are going to run that. It's this little play button right here. The motor is going to turn slowly. Nothing should be in the way. Okay. So we apply that, and there you go. Finish. So now the motor detection should be done. Let's go to additional info. Now this stuff isn't entirely necessary, but this is good to have when you're recording data. It will make sure that the speed readings and things related to that are accurate as far as VESC tool and or the controller sees. Motor pull, so I'll just give you these values. There are 30 motor pulls. The gear ratio is 1 because there's no gearing here. It is a hub motor, it's direct drive in. I mean, I don't know if that's the actual term, but this is 270 millimeters. That is the wheel diameter. Battery type, lithium ion, yes. Battery cells in series. This particular battery is a 12S, so that's 12 in series. Battery capacity, that is measured in amp hours, so that would be however many cells are in parallel combined with their capacity. So that is a 12S 1P battery, and the capacity of the single parallel cell is 4.1 amp hours, because it is a Molicel P42A. All right, the rest of this stuff doesn't really matter. Okay. Okay, so now that all of that is done, go over on the right and write this motor configuration. Now on the right you have these things for the motor configuration and the app configuration. The app configuration is what controls the motor, which we'll get into in a bit. And so the top one reads the motor configuration. That's whatever motor settings are currently written to the controller. And this reads, the middle one, little refresh symbol, it reads the default. And this writes any changes you've made in VESC tool on this program. After you make them and you're certain those are the changes you want to make, you write them and that writes them to the controller. So we are basically done with this. Our Hall sensors are set up. All of this is fantastic. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, Hall sensors, this is all good. This looks odd. Let's do it again. Oh wait, we did this already. Okay, I guess we're doing it again. Okay, great. It's not going to hurt doing it again. I think I just got paranoid by the red boxes. Green is always better. Apply. Huzzah. And just for good measure, write the motor configuration. Okay, so once all that detection is done and your motor is generally set up, we're going to go across these tabs here in the general section of the motor settings and just confirm stuff. Current, we did that already. This all seems fine. This all seems fine. This is actually kind of important. Down here, DRV 8301. This is an overcurrent mode. It's to basically prevent the DRV from blowing due to excessive current. I have this disabled. You could leave it on report only, so that way if you do have some sort of an overcurrent situation, the DRV in the controller, which is a specific chip that controls, I believe it controls the MOSFETs, and I could be getting that wrong, so forgive me if I'm wrong, it would report that to the fault log. I have it disabled, and there's been some weird behavior with this particular setup when you have this set to a current limit, and leaving that disabled seems to alleviate some of the torque dropouts. And so I'm sure that does present some other type of risk, but what are you going to do? The performance of this board is better with that disabled. Going to voltage, this is super important. This is something I mentioned before about voltage cutoffs. And the voltage cutoffs are appropriate on a non-balancing vehicle like an electric skateboard. And they're not appropriate here. So you want to set these both to 0. I mean, these are already low enough that your battery assumedly would never reach these voltages, but you don't want to set actual voltage cutoffs because, like I said, it will throttle back the power delivery to the motor, and in a balancing vehicle, that would make you fall. You want to use tiltback settings, which we're going to get to in a moment, to warn you that your battery is low. So we're going to leave that like that. RPM, max RPM, we don't need that. ERPM start, actually, no, I don't think we're ever going to reach that number of ERPMs, so Wattage, no. Temperature, no. These are fine. BMS is not connected. Advanced, anything here? Okay, so right here in the Advanced tab, you want to change this because the motor on the float wheel has this temperature sensor. So you want to make sure that that is set properly. That way the temperature reporting of that motor is correct. So we're going to go ahead and write this motor configuration again. All right, check FOC, Hall sensors, those are the same. This is all good. Don't use HFI or any of that stuff. And this all seems fine. Now we're going to jump into app settings, and the app segment is what controls the motor behavior. So the app is whatever control scheme is going to send power to the motor and tell the motor what to do. In the case of an electric skateboard, that is done with a handheld remote. So you have a throttle that makes it go forward, brake, reverse, all that sort of stuff. In this case, it is being controlled by a balancing unit inside the controller. You may have an external one attached, but the fact remains that the input to the system that's telling what the motor to do is a balancing circuit. And so when we go to General, make sure that Balance is selected. And if you have a handheld remote, you would be using something like PPM or UART. If you have some sort of like a throttle, doing an e-bike setup or a scooter, you'd use ADC most likely, etc., etc., etc. And here we're going to use Balance. So the Balance app is what's going to be our input source telling the motor what to do. So once you have that, we're going to go to the IMU page, and the IMU is the inertial measurement unit. I believe I got that right. And that is what is going to determine the orientation of this thing in space, and then use that to tell the motor what to do. Over here at the top, IMU type, internal. The Balance Pro has an internal IMU. If you are working with an external one, you probably don't really need this video, because if you've elected to do that, then you probably know much more than I do. But they have an array of external IMU models for you to choose from, and then it would interpret that data. But this is internal, and so that's what we're using. The sample rate here is 1000 Hertz, so we're changing that. We are changing this to the Mahoney mode. By all accounts, it is a slightly smoother and more accurate mode, and I haven't used Magic, and I have no current desire to start testing settings for that control mode. The accelerometer confidence decay is what basically balances how much of the accelerometer data is folded in.
He folds it in.
Incorporated in to the gyroscopic data that determines what the motor does. So this is going to be set to 0.10000000. Mahoney KP, I was given the setting of 0.38. I have not strayed from that, and so that is what I'm going to continue to use until someone smarter than me tells me to try otherwise. All right, going down. Now here is where we have offsets. Now the offsets for the accelerometer and the gyroscopes are all going to depend on your calibration. Now, this has already been calibrated multiple times, and so I already have the offset values for this specific controller in this specific setup. I've done the calibration a couple of different ways, and I usually come out with the same values, so I'm going to just plug in my values. Your offset values are going to be different because you need to calibrate your own controller and IMU. I will link below 2 different videos on how to calibrate the IMU in this Balance Pro. And they should work for other internal IMU controllers. All right, so one's a bit more complicated than the other, and that's just going to have to take some experimentation, but I'm going to just go ahead and use the values that I've gotten already and have been working. So, all right, the offset for X is 0. My offset for Y is 0.01. For Z, my offset was 0.015. 0.5. All right, gyro offset for X. The X-axis was 0.64. Okay, gyro offset for Y was actually 1.450. The gyro offset for Z was 0.3. Okay, gyro offset clamp, I left it at 5 degrees per second. And I believe that's it. These were left alone on mine. And like I said, you're going to do calibration on your own IMU, on your own controller, and then find the values that work for you. These are what worked for me, and I'm not going to go away from that because I have not changed any of the layout or any of the setup in this board. And so now that that is done, we're going to go ahead and write app configuration. Okay, so that is written to the controller. And now we're actually going to go into the balance app part of this. And this is what actually makes this behave the way, however you want it to behave. And so there are some operating conventions that we are going to set up first. And that's going to be, before we get into tune, into startup. This is what happens when you actually turn this thing on and it works. And it's not all of it. This is going to take a little bit of finagling here. Now the startup here, it says startup pitch axis angle tolerance. Now you can sort of break that phrase down and just come to a meaning of what those words actually mean, but the long and short of it is for this thing to turn on, the pitch, which is nose to tail lean, assuming this is set up the way it is and the way it's set up properly, at what angle range will this thing say it's okay to turn on? And so what I want, and you may or may not want this, is that when this thing comes to level, so I've stood on the board, and once it comes to level, when it assumes it is flat, that is when it turns on, because that's how a standard future motion one wheel works, and so I want to emulate that. So the startup pitch angle, axis angle tolerance, I'm going to keep very small. And you can change this to be a slightly wider range if you're having trouble with this activating, but I haven't had trouble with it activating. So I'm actually going to leave it at 0.5 degree, which means that there's a 0.5 degree off from center that this thing will perceive is upright and it will start. All right, startup roll axis angle tolerance. That means toe to heel. How tilted can it be before it turns on or doesn't? So if it's off on its side at a 45 degree angle, but it comes to what it feels is level, it shouldn't turn on because that means the board will have fallen over. So this is, I'm leaving at 8 degrees, which is a decent angle for this thing to be as far as, you know, toe to heel leveling. Startup centering speed, I kind of left that alone. I don't think it really matters because with a pitch angle tolerance that narrow of a 0.5 degree, once you reach level and it turns on, it's pretty much just gonna be centered, so it doesn't have to recenter itself. And brake current, I'm setting at 10. That is how much brake force is applied while the motor is on, and that's what will keep it from rolling away if you're on a hill and you're not actually using it. So that is that. We will write that configuration. Now we are going to go to tiltback. Tiltback, if you're a one-wheel person, is pushback. That's when the board resets what it considers level and gives you that as the default balancing position in order to signal something. And so the tiltback angle is at what angle, nose to tail, is it going to give you for pushback or tiltback. So I like that at 12 degrees. I think that's mild enough to not be awkward and throw you off, but it still is severe enough an angle for you to notice it. Tilt back speed, 5 degrees per second. That's, you can do the math of how fast you want it to tilt back. That's pretty slow. It would, well, it might be slow. It would take a little over 2 seconds for it to actually reach full tilt back angle. I have this, I believe I had this set at something like 10 degrees per second, which was probably fine. Yeah, I think it was at 10 degrees per second. Duty cycle tilt back. This is going to be a bit hard to explain because I'd have to explain duty cycle, but you can assume duty cycle is the full resources of the system. And that's a mix of the rotation speed of the motor, how much is left in the battery pack, and all the other limitations that are both physical and electrical that determine what this system can do. And that is seen in VESC tool as basically percentage. So here it's 0.75, that's 75%. So it's going to tilt back when I am currently using 75% of the full resources of this board. Now the thing with duty cycle is that it can go up and down based on different factors relatively quickly. So some folks will set this higher so that way they can go faster before it gives you tilt back. And that might be good in certain scenarios where you live on like very flat land and you're not likely to incur a hill out of nowhere where you're going at 85% duty cycle and then you hit an incline and then your motor does this, that, and the other, and then your duty cycle climbs to 95% and the motor shuts off. I leave mine at 75%. I think that's fine. It's currently faster than I want to go on this. I've gone 16, 17 miles per hour, and I think I hit maybe 65-ish% duty cycle at my current weight of 182, 181, something like that. I'm in the low 180s. And so that's something to take into account. I recommend leaving it at the default. If you know that you can go higher after you've used this machine and experimented with it, fine, set it higher. But for now, I'm leaving it at that. High voltage tilt back. That means that this will push back when it senses the battery voltage is way too high. So what does that even mean? You live on a hill, you charge this battery full, and then you go down the hill and regen brakes overcharges the battery. So fine. I have this set to 60 volts. Full voltage on that battery is 50.4 volts. 60 is a bit high. I've never actually done a thing where I've overcharged that battery on a hill because it's a very small battery, and the moment I go about 2 blocks, the battery is already down to 90% because that's, like I said, a very small battery. This whole thing is sort of a test setup. So you would basically, 4.2 volts per cell times however many cells you have in series, and I would say your high voltage tilt back should be at 4.25 volts per cell to be relatively safe. People will have different opinions on what is too much. You could also just have high voltage tilt back a hair above full just to signal whether or not you should stop overcharging your battery. Low voltage tilt back, let's do a quick calculation here. I want it to signal me with enough battery for me to kind of be able to get home. Not that I ever ride far with this. So I'd say low on this sort of thing is 3.2 volts per cell times 12, 38.4 volts. So let's do that, 38.4 volts. All right, that will give me pushback or tilt back when each cell is roughly at 3.2 volts. That's just near empty-ish with a little bit of wiggle room for sag if I have to go up a hill. And that should be fine. Constant tilt back. This is how much tilt back you have all the time. To explain it in Onewheel terms, if you've ever used elevated mode, the default level position of the board is not exactly flat. It's got the nose up a little bit. And so I actually have mine at 1/2 degree, and until some other settings become available in VESC tool to sort of work around inclines, having constant tilt back at 1/2 degree offsets some of the nose dip that comes from going up an incline and the board incurring a bit more resistance and or torque, and so I leave mine at 1/2 degree. You can leave it at 0 if you want to emulate an elevated mode. You would have it up, I don't know, I think maybe 3, 4 degrees, and you could ride like that to give the nose a bit more clearance. It's pretty cool, and you can alter that setting. Constant tilt back ERPM, I leave it at 500 ERPMs. That means that it won't actually engage that constant angle until you are moving. So I left it at that, and once I hit about 2-ish miles per hour, maybe 3, that is when the angle actually comes into effect. You can lower it, but I don't really see much of a reason to do that right now. So let's write those settings, and that is tilt back. Okay, now the last 2 things to do are fault and tune. And fault is going to be this whole big thing, because it's not just about errors and keeping this from the system burning itself out. It also has to do with the foot sensors. So talking about that, here we are with the foot sensors. The foot sensors, just like on a regular Onewheel, is a 2-zone pad. And the way this works is that it's a variable resistor that works off of pressure. So this is connected to wires, and what the controller is actually reading is the voltage from here. So without pressure on it, the resistance is at its general maximum, and so there is not a lot of voltage coming through to the controller. When you put pressure on the pad, the resistance goes down, and so the voltage reading on the controller goes up. How does that work? You stand on it, you add pressure, it reads it on there. So what the fault settings for those switches are going to do is that when you stand on it and it sees the voltage go above a certain threshold, those will be the conditions that it says are met in order to be able to turn on. So for example, you stand on this, the voltage goes up as it's being sensed from the pad. Great, they're above the threshold, everything is fine, you're standing on it. The board comes to level, voltage is above the threshold, it reaches the desired pitch angle, and then the motor will turn on and start balancing you. That's generally how it works. So what you want to do is, and this is different for every single board, every single foot pad, and this is something you have to sort of see yourself. What you got to do is you have to go over to the right, and you've got to turn on real-time data, and real-time data from the app, and real-time data from, you can do the IMU stuff later. You will have looked at the IMU sampling and data from there generally when you calibrate your IMU, which you should have done before you're setting this up. But what we're going to look at here is data from the app. And so all the way at the bottom, you've got here ADC1 and ADC2. Analog DC switch, I believe that the A stands for analog. I would assume so because it's an analog value. So if you look at that and you have your foot pad in your hand and you press down on one of them, you'll see the voltage goes up. Right now you see that little flicker, that's noise. So you don't want to set it, these are set to 0, which means it says switch value is on. That means that as far as this is concerned, I'm standing on it, which would be bad. So you want to set those high enough that it's not going to turn on when you're not standing on it, but you want to set it low enough that you won't stand on it and it won't detect you. So right here, you can see the voltage goes up as the resistance goes down, and the same thing happens on the other thing. Now, the trouble with this is that the values and the thresholds actually do change when you screw this down onto the board, because the wood, and therefore the sensor that's stuck to the wood, will change its shape a little bit. And so that means you have to do one of two things. Set a value and put it all back together and pray it works. Or if you have an Android device, you can open up the Android version of VESC tool, which would come with your download of VESC tool for Windows. And then once this is all closed up, you can look at the ADC values on there when this is all put together and done. So I already kind of have ADC values for this, and the way that I did it was that this was all together, and I put values that were above the noise you see happening here, that little flicker. All right, this is 0.0, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and this is more or less the same. When this is screwed down, those values change. The noise actually on one sensor goes up a little bit. And so you want it above the noise so that it doesn't randomly turn on and off, but you want it to the point where it would only take like hand pressure from 2 fingers here to activate it, so you can activate it without standing on it to test it out. And so the values that I've come to specifically for these are, let's see, I wrote them down, there we go. They're fairly low. For ADC switch 1, it's 0.08, and this was 0.8. All right, and so let's write those. And so you'll see once you write it, now it says the switch value is off. So this now recognizes I'm not standing on it, which is good. Okay, and now once that is done, we need to look at the fault delays. And once that is done, we need to look at the fault delays. So half switch fault delay means how long with only one zone activated before it shuts off. In one-wheel terms, you could think of when you raise your heel, how long does your heel have to be raised before the board turns off? And full switch fault delay, which means how long after your whole foot comes off of the sensor will the board shut off, or the motor will disengage rather. So I leave the half switch at 500 milliseconds, which is half a second. So if I lift my heel for half a second, the motor will shut off. The full switch fault delay, I have at 300 milliseconds, so it's roughly a third of a second. So if I jump off of this a third of a second later, the motor disengages. That's what I have it, and the ADC half state fault ERPM. Again, in one-wheel terms, how slow do you have to be moving before a heel lift will shut off the board? And this is measured in ERPMs, assuming everything is all done correctly. I have mine set to 600, and that's roughly a half a mile an hour, more or less. You can change that to your tastes, but that's what works here. So we're going to go ahead and write that app configuration again, and so now that section is done. Duty cycle fault cutoff, I have it at 95. That's the duty cycle, how much of the resources are we consuming before it shuts the motor off. And you want it at 95% just so that this thing doesn't ghost ride away and hit something. If the motor spins at maximum speed and it detects that, it will shut off. That does mean that you could technically push through the tiltback and then have this shut off because you're going too fast, but you want to kind of configure the duty cycle tiltback to work with that. Let's see, duty cycle fault, duty fault delay. I put this, I think at like 500 milliseconds. So if I go really, really fast and it's just like on accident, or I reach the duty cycle limit for some reason, I still have half a second to stop that before it just dumps me. Okay, pitch axis, fault cut off. Let's see, 20 degrees. I put this at, I think it was like 40. It's just basically, you want to set it high enough that if the nose touches the ground, it won't shut the motor off. Pitch fault delay, that doesn't matter. Roll axis fault cutoff. I set this, I think, to 35 degrees. So how much toe or heel lean before this considers itself fallen over and it also deactivates the motor? I have that set to 35 degrees. Fine. As far as I know, that should be it here. So once again, we will write those settings, and now we will move on to tune. So this uses a basic PID loop to determine the behavior, and each one of these values essentially ascribes itself to the lean and how long it's going to be before it returns back to level and how much power it does to overcompensate, and then there's error correction. And it would be best served if you went and looked up how PID controls work outside of this rather than me really explaining everything to you. I will give you my settings and also give you what I have been explained and what I understand to be what each of them do. Now loop hertz here, keep it at 1000 hertz. It's the same frequency as the IMU refresh rate, so that's good. So I left, all right, so balance filtering, I'm not using this yet. In a future update for VESC tool, this stuff might be worked in with slightly different PID settings. But as of right now, this stuff is just relatively straightforward. And so for P, the P setting basically is how far does the nose dip before it really starts to balance. Like it's basically the dip allowance. And so I have mine at 6. The I value is essentially an error correction value, more or less. And I have mine set to, there it is, 0.005. You don't want to set this too high too quickly. You can adjust this, but if you have it at 0.05, it'll feel very, very weird and will do some very weird things unless you're expecting it and using filtering and stuff like that. My D value is currently at 810. So I've got 6.005, 810. That's what works for me. It's sort of a slight modification off of settings that I've gotten from another gentleman, and a lot of the folks in the Floatwheel Discord sort of pass settings back and forth. These filter settings I'm leaving more or less alone, except for the D-term PT1 filter. Set that to 10 Hertz, otherwise your motor will sound like a very angry lightsaber, and you don't want that. I have no dead zone, and I have no current boost setting. So once that's done, right app configuration. All right, and that's basically it. Once you have all that stuff, you kind of want to make sure everything is written. Go back and check your settings to make sure that they were actually taken by the controller. And then you want to put this whole thing back together and not immediately stand on it, but test it on the ground using your hands to activate the board. So on the sensors, activate it, great. If it actually turns on when you expect it to and begins to balance, give it a bit of movement. See if it actually moves with your expected tilt and things like that. So that being said, I'm going to put this back together, and that's generally more or less all that I do to set this up as I have it riding. I hope these settings were helpful. I will put them in the blog article below, the actual numbers of them, and I'm hoping that will help you. I'll also export the app settings, because when you have VESC tool running, you can import an XML file with the settings that are used. I do recommend you do all the motor detection on your own and just import app settings instead of doing it all manually if you prefer. I'll have the XML file of the app settings export saved as well, and I'll post a link to that so you can just sort of try it. I, of course, make no guarantees on whether or not these settings work for your board perfectly, and you're going to have to tune them more or less yourself. So, once again, hope that was helpful. If you watched to the end, I assume it's because this video applied to you, and I hope to see you in the next video.